Good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Wiener, and I'm actually coming to you from my classroom. So this is a nice treat, huh? This is new. We're back on campus, and so I decided I was going to make my first video and actually appear before you, as opposed to just making videos on my desktop. We're going to hop right into it. We were discussing last time about the start of the French and Indian War and how a young Colonel Washington was sent up here to Fort Le Boeuf, which is right here in Pennsylvania, just south of Lake Erie, and how he delivered an ultimatum to the French that they leave this territory here that we see. If we recall, there was a string of forts that were set up by the French to stop the British from expanding west. Because recall, we have every 25 years the population of the British in North America, in the 13 colonies, is doubling. That means they have twice as many people every 25 years, okay? And so they're running out of places to live. They need more land. So Washington delivers this message, and what he ends up doing is he ends up getting himself in some trouble here. He hired a Native American scout to take him to Fort Le Boeuf. And on his way back, the scout had some beef, if you will. He had some problems with one of the French officers. And this Indian scout kills the French officer in a skirmish. And Washington is desperately trying to get back to Virginia. And that's where he really runs into some problems here. Let me show you on the map where we're at here. We have Fort Necessity. Here we have Fort Necessity, right? Doesn't look like much. I'll explain. Fort Necessity is a fort that Washington ends up building to protect himself from the French that are going to be coming in to attack him. Okay? Let's see if we can find it here on the map. Here it is. Perfect. Okay. So you'll notice this one's in red. That's because it's a British fort, all right? Now, Fort Necessity here, you see in the background here, is probably the worst possible place that you could build a fort. And it's, as you can see, it's not really a big fort. Now, this isn't the original one. That's a reconstruction of the one that Washington had built. But what you can tell here is that it was done in a hurry. It was done very quickly, and the reason for that is he didn't know when the French were coming in. And if you can look here, you can see it's built down here in a valley, okay? Let's go into 3D mode here, okay? You can see there's hills, and this is sort of in the mountains, right? He's trying to head back to Virginia. He's in the Appalachian Mountains, and Fort Necessity is built on the floor of a valley, which is a terrible place to build a fort, because all the people that have to do that want to attack the fort stand up here on the hill and shoot into the fort. It's easy. You can easily take that fort. And another thing, why does he call it Fort Necessity? What a terrible name for a fort, right? Something you have to understand about warfare during the 1700s, during the 18th century, is that if you were going to be an officer in the army, if you wanted to be a general one day, your reputation is probably the most valuable thing that you have, okay? So you can't just keep losing battle after battle after battle and expect that, you're going to have all this honor and glory. You're not. People are going to be like, that guy's a loser, okay? Washington builds a fort and he's about to lose it, and he knows that. But he would rather lose a fort than have to surrender himself out in the field. And this is important. This is because of the way that the warfare worked during this time period. Okay? Washington is trading a fort to the French, basically, so that he can escape with his men and go back to Virginia. That was the deal. That was how things were done. Now, when we look at this, first of all, it's named Fort Necessity, okay? Second of all, it's a pile of sticks. It's not impressive, okay? If you were to beat the crap out of the troops here at Fort Necessity, are you going to go around bragging, be like, oh yes, I had a great victory in defeating the troops at Fort Necessity? Washington was very clever here. He named it Fort Necessity to indicate that it was necessary. He needed it, all right? It was a necessity, okay? That explains its poor location. It's almost a slap in the face. No one is going to go around bragging how they beat Washington and they took Fort Necessity from him. And so his reputation is going to be maintained, while at the same time he's going to be able to get out of the situation that he found himself in. That wasn't really his fault. I mean, the Native American guy killed the French officer, so that was just sort of the cards that he was dealt, and he played the hand beautifully, and he's able to escape back to Virginia, and he's able to deliver the message. And that's what kicks off the French and Indian War, okay? And so the French and their Native American allies versus the British and their Native American allies, to include the Iroquois up here, they're fighting the French. And it doesn't go well for the French. In particular, the biggest battle really that took place during this entire time period was at Montreal. We'll get to that. Prior to that, though, it's not, the French initially look like they're going to win, because General Braddock leaves and comes down to Virginia, and he asks Washington to be his aide-de-camp. And General Braddock is this guy. He's Edward Braddock. He's a British general. He's promising Washington all sorts of things. Number one, the thing that Washington wants more than anything is to become an officer in the regular British Army. Instead of just being the commander of the Virginia militia, Washington wants to be an actual legitimate British officer. And so Braddock takes him under his wing and he makes him his aide-de-camp, which means that Braddock, it's Braddock, and then his right-hand man is Washington, okay? Braddock is putting together an expedition so that they can come up through here, all right? They're going to leave out of Virginia. In particular, it would have been down here, Williamsburg. That was the colonial capital of Virginia. So they're going to leave from here, and they're going to march all the way up to, they're going to march up to Fort Duquesne, which is in Pittsburgh. Now, it's called Pittsburgh, named after William Pitt. William Pitt is the prime minister. He's sort of like the king's right-hand man, Okay, he's the guy who's in charge of the Parliament, which is kind of like the British Congress. All right, and when we get involved here in this war with the French, William Pitt does something incredible. He says, "Don't worry about paying for this. We'll worry about that later. Whatever the colonies need in order to defeat the French, you have it." So he promises that we're going to go to war with France, and he's going to give us whatever we need. Okay? And this war takes place not just in America, but all over the world, all right? It's the first major world war, if you will. It took place in North America. It took place in the Caribbean. It took place in Europe. It took place in Asia. And in fact, India ends up becoming British. Prior to that, it was French, right? The French had colonized that area, and the British ended up taking it from them. So Braddock is going to march up to Fort Duquesne, which is this important fort that's right here at this important strategic location. You have the Allegheny River, you have the Monongahela River. They come together at this point to make the Ohio River. The Ohio River goes all the way, like we said during our last video, to the Mississippi River, which then of course dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico at the port of New Orleans. So from this point to New Orleans, if you control this and you control New Orleans, you control the entirety of the major waterways in North America. And that's how everything was shipped. All the goods, all the supplies. If you controlled that, it's like you controlled the highways, if you will. So what you get then is Braddock needs to take this, all right? And he's marching up with his troops. It's called the Braddock Expedition. And outside of the town here, okay, you have what's known as the Battle of Monongahela. And even though the British outnumbered the French 2-1, the French end up destroying the British in this battle, the Battle of Monongahela. And the reason for that is the Native Americans that were fighting. The British were not used to the style of warfare that Native Americans were going to employ on them. The British were used to marching in lines, doing formations, presenting, and firing in an open field. Well, the Native Americans didn't fight like that at all. They hid behind trees. They used cover. They used concealment. They didn't know from which they were getting shot at both directions, as they were marching up here in these straight columns and lines. The Indians were on the hills in the tree line firing down at them, and they just massacred them. Every single officer in the Braddock expedition was shot, wounded, and killed. To include General Braddock himself, dies at the Battle of Monongahela. The only officer that survived unscathed was Washington. And Washington gathers the forces, calls the retreat, brings them back, otherwise they would have been completely wiped out. And even though it's a disaster, they don't take Fort Duquesne. Washington is credited for saving the lives of his men, but it came at an expense. Braddock had promised Washington that he was going to make him a regular British officer after they took Fort Duquesne. But now that Braddock is dead, that never comes to pass. And that is something that is going to really haunt Washington for the rest of his military career. And he holds this huge amount of resentment towards the British Army as a result of it. And as you can probably tell, that's one of the motivating factors that makes him the commander-in-chief of the American Patriots during the American Revolution. So after the Battle of the Monongahela doesn't go well, things do turn around for the British. The British under General Wolfe end up coming into here, sailing up the St. Lawrence River, and they're able to take out Montreal, which is a big deal because there's a huge fort here in Montreal that was really difficult for the British to take. What you have here is in Montreal, you have a huge amount of hills that are on the northern side of the town here, and it's really difficult for them to take it. But the British end up finding a way around the fortifications here, and they end up sneaking in, and they're able to defeat the French, both in the Battle of Montreal and the Battle of Quebec. And so what you get then is, with the French defeated in 1763, the British pretty much control the entirety of North America. They don't control the western section. You know, this is Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. All of this belongs to Spain. In fact, under the Treaty of Paris, 1763, Louisiana is given to the Spanish as well. So the Spanish control Louisiana, they control Florida, they control what was at the time called New Spain, which would eventually become Mexico. All of that's under the Spanish control. But the rest of the continent, all of Canada, all of the eastern seaboard, which was the original 13 colonies, all the way west to the Mississippi River, this is all now controlled by Britain. Another important event happens in 1763. The king dies. King George II passes away, and the crown is inherited by his son, King George III. And the very first thing that King George III does is he issues a proclamation. And that's what this red line is here. It's called the Proclamation of 1763. And what the proclamation was he drew a line called the Proclamation Line. And he said, my subjects in America are not allowed to move west of this line. And the line basically traced the Appalachian Mountains. And you can understand maybe why he wanted this to happen. It's not a bad idea. Think about it like this. Who were we just fighting? We were fighting the French. Well, the French are gone. We were fighting the French and their Indian allies, right? Well, where do the Indian allies live? West of the Appalachian Mountains? Imagine if, my neighborhood went to war with your neighborhood and my neighborhood won, and then everybody in my neighborhood decides they're going to move into yours. Are we going to get along, or are we going to be at each other's throats? The king rightfully sees this as, well, let's let the dust settle before we start moving out into this new captured land. The problem was the Americans, the colonists, were not accustomed to this type of behavior from their king. They didn't like being told, you can't do this. You must do that. You can't move beyond this line. If you do, you're going to pay. They didn't like that. The entire point of fighting this war, which lasted 12 years, was to get this land. They fought, bled, and died for the opportunity to get this land. And now a new king comes in and he says, no, you can't you can't move over there yet. I'll let you know when you can, okay? They didn't like that at all. And so what you get here is the result, and this is very important. I need you to listen to this. This is, if you take anything away from this, this is what you need to know. The proclamation line, while it ends the chapter, if you will, on the French and Indian War, at the same time, it becomes the first cause of the American Revolution. It's the first time that the colonists really sort of put up a fight, if you will, or they have a grievance. They don't like what the king is doing, and they make that clear. No, we don't want to listen to that. And a lot of them just moved west of that line anyway. But what we see here is at the close of the French and Indian War, that's our first real cause of tension between what one day will become the Americans versus the British. And that's really all I got for you today. Tomorrow we're going to talk, we're just basically going to do a review of all of our colonization stuff. And then Wednesday, we're going to have a test on a colonization unit. And then from there, we'll go into the causes of the American Revolution. So that's all I got for you today. I hope you had a good weekend and have a great day. Thanks.